All right. Thank you very much, dear students, for having joined me tonight. Well, not tonight, today actually. I'm sorry, I just got used to say that. Well, anyways, none of you were able to join me in this opportunity. I understand it's fully comprehensible. I know that many of you have other activities. We are right now on Saturday, therefore, of course, many of you are working, and many of you are just having a very I don't know, advantageous and socially productive morning with your friends. That's totally fine. So as I say, what we're going to be doing in this class is to practice for the listening section, as now we have been learning, of course, about it during the entire week. And in this opportunity, we are going to practice trying to make our exercises identical to the ones you're going to find on the exam, okay? So let me share my screen with you. And what we are going to be doing today is to practice by listening lectures and conversations as we, of course, discuss will be part of your material in this particular section. So we're going to listen to a lecture, in this case, on a biology class, and I want you to please take notes on this. Grab a piece of paper, grab your pencil, and help me with your notes, because by taking notes, you are going to be able, of course, to consult them later on in the detailed questions and any other question that requires you to go and look for information, right? So please take your notes, as I say, and then we're going to be responding to all the questions one by one, and I'm going to explain to you the methodology we're going to use, okay? But first of all, let us listen to this lecture on a biology class. Let's go.
Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
Right. So we already know that animals act in ways that help them to adapt and survive in their environment. For example, think of foraging for food, seeking a mate, protecting the young. You get the idea. In biology, we refer to these activities as behavior. Now, the big question today is, are these patterns of behavior defined by genetic influences encoded by evolution, or is behavior more heavily influenced by things like experiences and interactions with the environment? Now, in order to find genetic links to behavior, you first need to get rid of, deactivate, or manipulate a gene or several genes in order to see if this deactivation has a specific effect on an organism's behavior. One of the earliest genes to be connected to behavior was discovered in the 1970s, and it is called period. Scientists discovered that the period gene influenced the mating behavior of fruit flies, specifically the fruit fly's courting song. And this discovery suggests that genes were of vital importance to behavior and ultimately in animals' survival too. But maybe coming to that conclusion is getting a little ahead of ourselves. It's also important to consider how genes are regulated, because this also has an impact on specific behavioral patterns in animals. While genes create protein, while their primary function is to create protein, there's also a second part of the gene that regulates how long, as well as when and where the gene creates the protein. And this regulatory part of the gene can have a significant impact on the animal's behavior. Animals of the same genetic construction can have very different patterns of behavior in mating, for example, just because of a difference in the regulatory part of the gene. So, as you can see, genes are a lot more complex than you might expect. With this in mind, it's important to note that genes aren't always fixed or isolated from external influences. Actually, an animal's innate genetic basis is just one of a lot of components that can influence behavior. In fact, external environmental influences don't necessarily affect just one gene, but can interact with hundreds of thousands of genes. I never said this topic was going to be easy. Let's take the example of the foraging gene. It's this gene that can be found across a broad spectrum of species, including honeybees, cows, green algae, and even humans. But of course, it doesn't produce the same patterns of behavior in all these cases. The honeybee, for example, transitions from being a hive worker to a forager when the gene in its brain changes in response to social cues that the bee collects from chemicals sent out by its fellow bees. This stands in strong contrast to the fruit fly, which acts as a forager for its whole life cycle. The chemicals that surround the honeybee effectively generate the change in behavior. So this means that genes actually respond and react to social and environmental influences. So behavior is the result of an interactive relationship that genes have with other components, like the environment. In fact, it's even possible for aspects of the environment to impact gene expression among animals. A cichlid fish, for example, lives within a very rigid, hierarchical social system. If the dominant male fish is removed from the social group, a subordinate fish immediately expresses the EGR1 gene in its brain. This causes a significant change in its behavior and physical color. So all of this shows that a complex series of activities in the animal's body can take place. And a lot can happen when the animal is confronted with a change in its environment, quickly choosing or assigning priorities in order to adapt to the situation. A change in expression of particular genes can also have an impact on future generations of an animal without necessarily involving a mutation in the gene. In an experiment conducted by Michael Meany of McGill University, he discovered that baby rats weren't particularly reactive to stress if their mother dedicated time to grooming and caring for them. He also found that these same rats developed a very similar pattern of behavior when they had their own offspring. Another group of rats that didn't receive the same treatment from their mothers were found to be much more reactive to stress and neglectful of their own offspring. So what's the genetic story here? The behavior patterns are not coming from traditional genetics. They are coming from the interactions with the mother rats, which influence the ways that genes are expressed. As I said earlier, genes aren't straightforward. They are extremely complex.
Well, great. Now we have listened to this lecture and it's time for us to respond to questions we have assigned for this material. As you remember, you have 6 questions per lecture and 5 per conversation. Therefore, this lecture in a biology class is going to have 6 questions. Okay, fantastic. So it's time for us to respond. And as you can see here, we have the first question for this lecture. Now, how are we going to respond? We're going to respond, okay, all of you, I please want to take a piece of paper. I also want you to take a pencil or something to write down with. And please write down first question. And once you choose the correct response that you consider to be, in this case, the accurate one, please write down, right? My first question, my response would be option 3, for example. Okay, so you write down in your paper, first question, option 3, right? And you do exactly the same with the second question, third question, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now we're going to have 45 seconds in order to respond each of those questions. As I told you in the actual exam, you have from 45 seconds to 1 minute in order to respond these questions. Given that you are not able to administer your own time, as it happened in the reading section, you may remember that we had the opportunity to spend 10 seconds if we wanted in this part and 5 minutes in the other. Sadly, it's not the case here. They give us a limited time for every single question. Therefore, 45 seconds is going to be our top in this case, okay? So I have my chronometer here prepared, and each 45 seconds, my chronometer is going to emit a sound. And once the sound, of course, warns us that the 45 seconds are over, I'm going to move to the other question. And so please try to respond all these questions before these 45 seconds are over, all right? So great, we're gonna start with this 45 seconds then. And please, all of you start, please, responding to the question now. All right, very good. The 45 seconds are over, as you can see. Well, by the way, I'm going to choose random responses, all right? Just in case you are maybe wondering, oh, but the professor already showed us the correct response. No, I'm just choosing the one that I consider, I'm just choosing the one that I see more rapidly or something like that. But I'm choosing completely aleatory responses in order for me not to influence your responses. The correct ones, we're going to discover them and, of course, realize and analyze them at the end of all these questions. Okay, so please don't let yourself to be guided by don't let yourself to be guided by responses in this question or in the following ones, because I'm not going for the correct response. I'm just choosing an aleatory one in order for me to continue. Okay, so let's go to the second question. You have 45 seconds once again in order to respond, and you can start doing it now. Okay, those are the 45 seconds. Now I'm going to choose an aleatory response, and let's move on to the next question. 45 seconds again. You can start responding now. There we are. Let's choose again an aleatory response. Let's move on to the next question. 45 seconds on the clock. You can start responding now. Great. Again, a random response I'm picking, and I'll move on to the next question. In this case, we have to listen again to one part of the lecture, so let us listen together.
Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Scientists discovered that the period gene influenced the mating behavior of fruit flies, specifically the fruit fly's courting song. And this discovery suggests that genes were of vital importance to behavior and ultimately in animals' survival too. But maybe coming to that conclusion is getting a little ahead of ourselves.
What does the professor mean when he says this?
But maybe coming to that conclusion is getting a little ahead of ourselves.
All right. You have 45 seconds to respond, starting now. All right, let's go with the last question. You have to listen once again, so let us do it together.
Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
In fact, external environmental influences don't necessarily affect just one gene, but can interact with hundreds of thousands of genes. I never said this topic was going to be easy.
Why does the professor say this?
I never said this topic was going to be easy.
All right. Apart from those, they're very much creepy laughs. Let's continue with the response. All right. Very good. Well, we have finalized with this round of questions and with this material, so it's time for us to see the correct responses, okay? To go back, back, back. Great, here we are. So it says, according to the professor, why is it important to note the regulatory part of a gene? Oh, and we have one question before. What is the main topic of the lecture? And here it says the nuances of a component that influence or that influences animal behavior. Well, we have seen this, right? That we are now talking about genes and, well, their interaction and their contribution and, of course, their influence towards animal behavior. Therefore, this is certainly the main topic because, as I told you, the way you identify the main topic is by thinking and, of course, analyzing what is that single idea that unifies all the information and data mentioned here in this lecture. If you think about our lecture, if we didn't have this main idea, nuances of the component, that is to say the gene, right, that influences animal behavior, our lecture would be a compilation of very unconnected and totally well, useless information because we wouldn't have anything connecting the information and making sense of it. So as I say, this particular idea unifies and becomes our lecture a very, very good whole that remains very rigid and solid, right? And it has a start and it has as well, it has a conclusion, it has an end, and it certainly fulfills its purpose, that is to show and demonstrate that this component certainly influences animal behavior in a very complex way, right? Option B, unresolved debate and the main arguments of both sides. This is totally true because in this case, we are not listening to different allegations and, of course, objections to arguments and debates on the scientific community, right? So this is certainly false. A scientific discovery and its implications within the study of genetics is not true as well, because in this case, the professor never talked about new discoveries or things of that sort, but the professor merely talked about how our current knowledge of genes led us to understand that, well, this has a very important and noticeable influence on animal behavior and all the complexities and all the intricate, let's say, well, implications that of course, brought to scientific discussion on this topic. The last one, a series of specific patterns of animal behavior and their individual explanations. Well, yeah, this could be tempting. Nonetheless, notice that in this case, this sentence is completely, well, omitting and neglecting the mention of genes, or as in this case, the first response did, a component that influences animal behavior, and is merely discussing animal behavior and the individual explanations of those behaviors. So this cannot be the correct response because it omits a part very, very, very much significant and transcendental of the main idea in this lecture. That is, as I say, the component that causes this, the genes, right? All right, What about this one? According to the professor, why is it important to know the regulatory part of a gene? And in this case, it is because it interacts directly, or excuse me, it can generate varying behavioral patterns, right? Well, we have seen this, right? That the regulatory part of genes generates varying behavioral patterns. That is to say, well, they somehow take and generate varying behaviors that depends, of course, on the circumstance that the animal is going through. So this is a great response. This is a detailed question, by the way, if you notice. Detailed questions are those ones that simply ask, what did the passage say about this, right? And in this case, what did the lecture say about the regulatory part of a gene? Very easy response, right? It interacts directly with external stimuli. It's wrong because in this case, the professor didn't make any specific connection between external stimuli and these well, regulatory parts and sites of the gene. And it proves genes are not connected to behavior. This is actually the other way around, right? The passage during the entire duration of itself tells us that these genes actually influence and of course have very important counseling and guidance in behavior. So it just cannot be the correct response. It suggests genes possess two parts rather than one. Well, we are never listening to such a connection in the lecture, right? Question number 3. Why does the professor discuss the differentiation gene? And in this case, it's because to show how a gene can generate different behaviors among animals as it reacts to environmental influences. Well, differentiation, you know that in this case, the professor, when he discussed this, said that animals have a lot of behaviors depending on the context or the particular circumstance they found well, at that time. Therefore, this of course can generate a lot of influences and guidances depending on the environmental context that the animal is going through. Therefore, of course, this is the correct response. And as I told you, this is mentioned, right? Why does the professor discuss this topic? This is this type of question that is a purpose question or a function question, in which the overall or general question is always, why did the professor mention this in his lecture? And in this case, it was to bring to the table how these different behaviors are affected by circumstances that, as well as I say, represent very different contexts. So this is the correct response, okay? What about second answer? To prove that the innate genetic basis of an animal does not influence behavioral patterns? Well, it cannot be the correct response because the professor never said that innate genetic basis of an animal doesn't influence behavior patterns, but actually the other way around. He says that this genetic basis and foundation on the animal actually influences behavioral patterns, right? So it's giving us counterfactual information. Third option, to reinforce the idea that genes create proteins directly linked to the fixed behavior across animals. Again, incorrect, because it's telling us that well, genes create proteins directly. Well, in this case, we never listen to proteins apart from, of course, the first or the very beginning of the lecture, when the professor said that although the main task of genes is to create these proteins, they are actually fulfilling a second role that is very important in affecting animal behavior, but not, of course, a conjunction or not a blending of those skills as this response is trying to portray. So therefore, it's incorrect. To introduce the idea that some genes are unique to a species and therefore generate unique behavioral patterns, we never listen to this endemic postulation on the lecture, right? So it cannot be true. Well, next question. What can be inferred about the diversity of animal behavior? Well, it reflects the complexity of the species as various genes and environmental elements interact. And this is the only correct response we can infer, because the entire lecture says that, well, because the animal behavior it's so rich and in this case vary, we can also understand that genes interact with external elements very much to the point that they consider and they will not consider to the point that they create and that they generate several behaviors that are not plausibly explainable without looking at the different genes and of course environmental factors that interact with these genes, right? Therefore is the correct response. Second one, it is the result of innate genetic programs that have slowly altered through the many stages of evolution. Well, sadly, we never listened to any particular sentence in the lecture implying that this is the case, that is part of some evolutionary process. We never listened about that. It represents a rare example of the principles of genetics failing to explain aspects of diversity. Not at all, right? Actually, this is the contrary, because in the lecture we listened that we are able to explain this animals' behavior through genetics foundations, and not that they fail to explain such a phenomenon, right? So this is confusing information. And the fourth one, it is evidence that supports the view that innate patterns of behavior can be overriding over the course of time. It is also incorrect, because in this case, we are not seeing that animals lose their behaviors, that they forget their natural inclinations with regard to environmental factors, but they actually remain with them through the course of time, right? So it cannot be the correct answer as well. Well, next, we have question number 5, and we had to listen. Let us listen once again.
Listen again. What does the professor mean when he says this?
But maybe coming to that conclusion is getting a little ahead of ourselves.
Well, I think that this is very clear, right? He's suggesting that the conclusion is premature and that it requires closer scrutiny. Well, he says, right? But I think that we are too ahead in order to particularly believe that is the case. Of course, what he's trying to say is that the conclusion to say that, well, of course, these genes affect the environment, etc., is too premature, and we need to have a closer scrutiny and investigation of that subject. I think it's very clear in this case. Nonetheless, he's suggesting that the conclusion is false despite the evidence of period gene. Not true, because he's not objecting the evidence or the data he has available, but he simply says that the conclusion could be too adventured and too, let's say, it will be too much risky in this case, because we have not enough information in order to make predictable and testable conclusions, right? He's emphasizing the significance of the conclusion as forward thinking. Well, not at all, right? He's not saying that this has some sort of revolutionary aspect or something. This cannot be the correct response. And the final one, he's highlighting the advanced nature of the conclusion due to its complexity. He's not, in this case, praising the conclusion. What he's doing is trying to warn people that it cannot be considered a compelling or totally undebatable in this case, because it's not fully tested, nor we are, in this case, with the capacity to argue this is a totally tested and totally finalized theory, right? So it cannot be the correct response in this case. And final question, here we have the number 6. We have to listen again, so let's go.
Listen again. Why does the professor say this?
I never said this topic was going to be easy.
As I told you, I like how he laughs here. But to suggest that the diversity and complexity of gene interaction can cause confusion, right? So when he says, I never said this topic would be easy, what he's saying is that, of course, given that the complexity and the variations in this phenomena are very, very much usual and very much constant, they can cause a lot of confusion on his students, right? I think that it's very clear as well here. The other option is to point out that integrated structures of genes that influence patterns of behavior. Not true, because in this case, he's not discussing, let's say, complicated or advanced genes that influence structures and behavior. To emphasize the difficulty of connecting specific genes to animal behavior, well, he's not talking about animal behavior whatsoever, so it cannot be the correct response. And the first one, to suggest that theories and research in animal behavior are often misleadingly simple. Well, misleadingly simple, I'm sorry. And well, this is actually counterfactual information, because the entire passage tells us that, well, indeed, theories and research in animal behavior are actually, very much efficient when explaining the available data, not that they are misleadingly simple, right? So as I say, the correct response is this. Well, let's go with another topic. I know that, of course, you want to continue practicing. Let's repeat the exercise, listen to this, take your notes, and then we're going to respond one by one and, of course, offer some feedback. Okay, so listen to this new lecture in on film theory. Let's go.
Listen to part of a lecture in a class on film theory.
The early history of American film was tumultuous. There was a lot happening. But it was a couple decades later that the biggest change, The biggest revolution in directing and acting really came about in the 1950s. I'm talking about the development of method acting. So, what is method acting exactly? Anyone?
I guess it's about embodying characters with all your heart, like actually living through their experiences. You, the actor, I mean.
Okay, that's a good place to start. Yes, Ron, can you add to that?
Well, not really. It's just that I'm not sure I entirely get what's so different about method acting compared to classical acting. I mean, since the very first movies, directors always probably told their actors to try to identify with their characters and be authentic, right?
Okay, good. Good question. I'll clear that up in a moment, but first let's expand a bit on the meaning of method acting. Method actors were told to eliminate mannered, artificial elements from their performances. They were supposed to be their characters, in a sense, to get rid of the telltale signs of acting. On the other hand, classical acting technique really emphasized things like elocution, speaking with fluency and beauty. There was also a heavy emphasis on rehearsal. Actors were supposed to do a performance the same way every time so that the camera takes would be consistent between shoots. This might be a bit of an oversimplification, but classical acting stressed perfectionism. Method acting, meanwhile, undermined the idea that there was even an ideal to strive for in the first place. Actors were told to do what seemed natural to them. Some directors actually thought too much rehearsal ruined the truthfulness and spontaneity of performances. Okay, so let's bring this down to earth with an example. Why is A Streetcar Named Desire considered to be such an important film of American cinema from the perspective of method acting in the 1950s?
Marlon Brando's performance as Stanley was the first major mainstream example of method acting, right?
Well, that's close. The director, Elia Kazan, he'd worked with most of the cast on Broadway, and he used method acting techniques in that staged version. When he made the movie version, he tried to make all the actors use method acting. So it wasn't that Brando was the first exactly. He just did it more famously than the others because he was so charismatic. But you can really see his approach in his performance. He did things like absent-mindedly picking lint off his shirt in some scenes, he picked the lint off of his wife's shirt. I mean, the character of his wife. The point is that Brando's character Stanley is essentially a brute, but Brando's spontaneous acting choices humanized him. His naturalism helped the audience to sympathize with him, and that performance paved the way for decades of performers in the future.
I have a question. I actually prefer Vivian Lee's performance to Brando's in the movie. She played her role with such intensity. It seems so real. So why isn't Lee's performance considered to be a groundbreaking example of method acting? Why does Brando get all the credit?
Actually, Lee wasn't a method actress at all. She was classically trained, an opponent of method acting. She thought it was sloppy and unrehearsed. She constantly argued with the director of A Streetcar Named Desire and resisted a lot of his advice.
But her performance was so incredibly raw.
Well, her character was meant to be very melodramatic and theatrical. She had every word planned, was meant to be false and to manipulate the audience. From that perspective, a very rehearsed, dramatic, and articulate performance like Lee's seems totally authentic, even if it's actually heavily rehearsed. You could say that Lee's classical approach was just a close fit for the character she played. But it's great that you brought this up, because that makes an important point about the styles of acting. Method acting isn't by default better than the classical approach. In fact, many critics today call Lee's performance among the greatest acting triumphs of all time. Nonetheless, Brando's method acting was more influential in the long run.
Well, great. We have listened now to this lecture on film theory, and it's time for us to respond to using the same methodology that we have used before. So let's start with the questions. You have 4 or 5 seconds to respond to each of them, and please start with the first one now. Don't forget to take your notes on which response you are choosing, right, in order to compare them later on. Let's go. There you are. Choose any response. Okay, question number 2. Gonna start now. Okay, next question. Great, here we are. Let's go with this one. As I say, random questions and choosing. All right, number 4. Let's start now. Okay, last question. Great. Well, let's go with this one. I'm going to be. Oh no, there's one more. I'm sorry, I confused this one with a conversation, but given that it is a lecture, it has 6 different questions. So let's go with the last one. Okay, there you are. So this is it. we have finalized them with the questions. I'm going to choose this one just to choose something, you know. Well, let's go then with the questions. Okay. Well, let's go. So what is the main topic of the lecture here? It says, in this case, it was a naturalistic acting method and a famous application of it. And this is true because we have seen right throughout the lecture that this method, I think they call it the method. Oh yeah, they call it the method acting, right? Yes, the acting method. A method actor, that is to say, basically to somehow improvise and, well, to be totally free during your performances. That is to say, to come up with totally improvised and innovative lines and sentences to cover your role in the movie or film you were somehow involved with, was a very much famous method during the 70s, and that it became very much popular because of a particular movie that we have listened to, in which Marlon Brando interpreted a character using this method, right? So here we have it. This is the correct response, right? Because that is the idea unifying everything. All the rest of information that has been mentioned is just because we want to make sure that everything with regard to this idea is covered and unified, right? Well, let's continue. A defining character of films created in the 1950s. I'm sorry. So this is not the correct response because defining characteristic of films is not actually the main idea. Films are simply, let's say, the space in which this acting method is developed. But films are not, in this case, the main characters of our lecture. They are not the center of attention nor focus. Therefore, they cannot be the main idea, right? One method of acting gained influence but failed to maintain it. In this case, well, we have not seen actually that it gained influence, but it didn't maintain it for a long time. We are not informed about that. Maybe that's true in the actual war, but nonetheless, in our lecture, we don't listen about this method falling out of popularity or something like that. So it cannot be the correct response. And fourth one, two types of acting and their respective advantages and disadvantages, not the correct response as well, because, well, we are not listening, nor of course understanding if this is actually true. That is to say, if there were more than, well, in this case, the traditional approach to acting is discussed at the very beginning of the lecture. Nonetheless, this method in order to perform on movies and films is very briefly discussed and then is totally forgotten and covered, of course, living in the shadow of the method acting, right? So, well, it cannot be the correct response. Well, let's continue. Second question. According to the professor, what most characterize classical acting in comparison to method acting? In this case, the pursuit of an ideal performance through rigorous rehearsal. Well, here, as I say, we are discussing classical acting. That is to say, that very ancient and old method that we have discussed very briefly at the beginning of this lecture, that is the classical approach to acting. And this one, it said that this method, the classical one, was very much rigorously rehearsed. That is to say, it required actors to practice and perfect their performances before actually acting. But of course, that is totally contrary and different to the method acting, in which actors and actresses are not actually required to practice, but to improvise all their lines and to let their nature and mind to guide them. Well, that is the correct response, right? The intent to manipulate audience members' emotions. This is actually part of the method acting, not of the classical acting. Therefore, it cannot be the correct response. Less careful attention to the precise words of the script. This is, as I say again, this is part of the method acting, but not of the classical acting. And notice that this detailed question is asking us about the classical acting. What most characterized the classical method, not the method acting that is the one that we listen about in the rest of the lecture. What about the first response? Casting actors who are well suited for the roles that they will play. Again, this is actually part of the method acting. So all of these responses that are false are actually characteristics of the method acting, and they are trying to confuse you because, as I say, This classical method was briefly mentioned at the beginning, and the only thing that was mentioned about this, it was that it was, as I say, rigorously rehearsed. Therefore, this is the only correct response, right? Third question, what does a professor introduce a streetcar named Desire? And the reason is to provide a concrete example of changes in film direction in the 1950s. And this is because he tells us, right, that the director of this movie, that was a very, very much revolutionary one, somehow asked all his crews, or excuse me, all his crew members, or basically his actors and actresses, to to improvise. That is to say, to to come out with their lines and dialogues very naturally without even rehearsing them, and because he wanted to, of course, fulfill or to attain a very much natural and realistic effect on the audience who would watch this movie. So as I say, this is the correct response. This new change in director of movies that, as I mentioned, were now disposed and eager actually to ask his or their actor and actresses in order for them to perform completely improvised in their movies and films. Well, what about the first response, to emphasize how long it took for method acting to adopt or to be adopted by filmmakers? Well, we are never talked about any specific date or any specific time that was necessary and mandatory for directors to somehow open themselves to this new acting methodology. So it cannot be the correct response. Not about the second one, to suggest that it was the first film created by a director familiar with method acting is not the case, because notice, it says that it was the first time in which the director asked his crew to utilize this new methodology in order to cause a very realistic and revolutionary response in the audience who would watch this movie. Nonetheless, it doesn't say that it was the first director who was aware of this methodology. We are never said that, so please try to make or try to avoid wrong assumptions in this case, because this answer is trying to confuse you. As I say, the lecture never tells us that this director was the first one aware and conscious of this methodology, but was the first one disposed to utilize it and to include it in his new projects and films. What about the fourth one? To illustrate the merits of Marlon Brando's trainings as a classical actor? Well, not at all, right? Because Marlon Brando is merely part of this explanation of the streetcar named Desire. But the real reason why the professor includes this is because he wants to demonstrate a new change and a new direction taken by directors in the film academia starting from 1950s, right? Next question. According to the professor, what effect did Brando's spontaneous acting choices have? They helped moviegoers to feel compassion towards an otherwise unlikable character, right? Because he says that Marlon Brando character was very, very difficult to tolerate. People would reluctantly tolerate and accept a character of that nature. Nonetheless, because of this incredible performance, who was part of this methodology acting, he actually was able to convey a very, very much comprehensive and somehow, admirable, or I don't know, tolerable version of this character, right? So that is what the movie says, what the lecture says. What about the second option? They established Brando's charisma, which was an important part of his later career. We are not here discussing Brando's charisma as mourning or being born in this case on this movie, but the only thing that we are discussing is that he used his charisma in order to make his approach or method very much convincing and compelling to people. But we are never listening to Brando Marlowe's charisma being born in this movie. That is what this question, or what this response is trying to suggest. They complicated the relationship between Marlowe and his wife. Well, simply false. We are never told about that. They created difficulty for the director because they interfere with consistency between shoots. We are never listening about this, right? Next question. What is the male student's attitude toward being late? Her powerfully emotional performance was preferable to that of Brando. And this is when the student says, right, I don't understand why people pay too much attention to Brando when actually I believe that this actress, Vivian Leigh, had a way more remarkable performance. But the professor says that, Well, and he continues, right? But the male opinion on this woman or actress is that her powerful emotional performance was preferable to that of Brando, because he says, right, I am surprised that people pay too much attention to Brando, but they totally ignore Vivian Leigh's performance, right? So of course that tells you that her powerfully emotional performance was preferable for him to that of the Brando Marlowe performance, right? So well, her heavily rehearsed dramatic acting style added authenticity to her role. Yeah, I mean, this is true, but nonetheless, this is not what the student says. He says that, right, as in I quote in the sentence, oh, I don't understand why this is too much ignored. And people merely talked about Marlon Brando, right? So given those words, this is the correct response, because this cannot be inferred from that sentence. It is clear by her intense performance that she was classically trained. The contrary, right? He never says something like that. Or she received less praise from Brando than her expertise should have gathered. Notice that in this case, it's mentioning her expertise, and the student never talked about her expertise, but her performance. So be very careful, because these questions or these responses try to confuse you. And last one, what can be inferred about Vivian Leigh's classical training? That it contributed to a performance that's celebrated by critics despite the influence of method acting, right? Well, so in this case, as I say, Vivian Leigh was actually a classical actress. She was not elect in the method. Nonetheless, it contributed to a performance that's celebrated by critics despite the influence of method acting. People say, well, Marlon Brando had method acting, but this Vivian Leigh's routine was practiced and rehearsed. Nonetheless, it was a fantastic performance, although the method acting became way more popular from then on. So as I said, this is the correct response, right? Because it's what we can infer from this information, that although she didn't use the method, her performance was acclaimed as well, and nowadays is very much recognized by many critics and authors to be one of the greatest performances of all time. It is probably more appropriate for older, more sliced plays. Well, we're never listening to something like that. Like you have to be, I don't know, 50 years old in order to use a classical method. We never listen to something like that, because it led to a surprising authentic acting. Modern directors still train actors in the same technique. This is actually false, right? Because the lecture tells us or suggests that now and from then on is the acting method that has become more relevant and utilized in the film academia, and not so the classical method, right? And what about the last response that says Leigh renounced her training after numerous discussions with the director of a streetcar named Desire? Well, we never listened to something like that, right? Like that she rejected or she stopped practicing or training for her performances is never discussed in this lecture. Well, as you can see there, students, those are our practices for today's class. I'm going to be sending anyways to the class a lot of practices apart from these ones, and you can well rewatch this class in order to check out your responses and to practice with the ones that I'm going to be sending that are, as I say, auxiliary and certainly more practice and more material for you to improve or perfect your performances. Well, thank you very much for having joined me. Have a wonderful weekend, and I see you next Tuesday.